Welcome to the Print's soft cover. We have with us today a set of wonderful editors who have edited this book called Anchoring Change, which documents 75 years of social sector interventions, of social enterprises, CSOs, and quite a fabulous collection of initiatives. So we have with us today Vikram Singh Mehta, who is the chairman and distinguished fellow Center for Social and Economic Progress, Neelima Khetan, who is a partner with Noose Consultants, and Jayapadma RV, who is a development practitioner. So to begin with, welcome to the Print soft cover, and let me first, so I have a copy of the book with me, so let me just unwrap it for our viewers. So can you all see?
Yes. Your situation.
No, yes.
Oh, that's lovely.
I think that's something.
Okay. Thank you. Let me just start with Vikram. To begin with, what was the driving idea behind the book, and how easy or difficult was it for you to narrow down 75 years of development sector initiatives into and to narrow it down to 24 examples to begin with, why did you decide to do the book, all of you?
Thank you, and we're delighted to be on your program. The idea for this book sort of germinated in my mind because of my concern that liberal, middle and upper class Indians focus disproportionate amount of attention on what has gone wrong with our country and don't really spend enough time on dwelling on the successes. This focus on what has gone wrong is understandable. There are many problems that we face, and 75 years into our independence, we are still struggling to achieve the promises made by our founding fathers at the stroke of midnight, August 1947. Our country is divided along economic and social lines. We have yet to reach our full potential in terms of economic growth, although I dare say we are proud of the fact that we are the fastest, or amongst the fastest growing economies in the world. We have probably the largest number of absolutely poor people in the world, in our society. So there are many, many issues that we can talk about. And we do, in our drawing rooms, focus disproportionate attention on those issues. My concern was that this focus on just what has gone wrong does perpetuate a sense of negativism. And it gives us feeling that nothing has been done right. And that is wrong. I come from Udaipur, which has been at the heart of voluntarism and civic interventions. And I've seen indirectly and directly the impact that individuals and institutions have made on the lives of people. And so the idea struck me that it is time now, as we celebrate 75 years of our independence, to also alert people on the successes, to make people aware of the tremendous work that organizations led by individuals, civic society, NGOs, governments, and business have had on shifting the needle of social progress. We have a lot to learn from those successes. And as we look forward into the next 75 years, the time has come for us to distill those learnings and input them into the developmental model for the future. So that was the basic premise that underlay my thinking. I discussed this with Neelima, who has been in the social sector for most of her working life, if not all of her working life. And we had also brought in Jaya. And the three of us thought that this was a very a good idea. We presented the proposal to HarperCollins. They also supported this project. And their only one request was that we should try and bring out the publication in or around the 75th year of our independence. That is August 2022. So that's the genesis of the book. Now, how did we go about selecting these 24? This was actually a very difficult task. And I dare say Neelima and Jaya will have something to add to what I'm going to say. But let me just start that thought by saying that we did a lot of research. We looked at probably 100 organizations across the country that have been engaged in grassroots work since independence. And they have done a tremendous work. Their impact has been significant. So clearly we could not choose 100. So the challenge for us was how do we narrow it down to the 24, 25 stories that would fit into the book length size that was acceptable to HarperCollins, our publishers. And we made certain decisions internally. First is that we decided that we would not try and define the word success amongst the three of us. We would actually, because there are many different ways by which you can define success. There are many metrics by which you could look at success. We decided that we would actually agree on the word significance. We would only we would look at those organizations that had made a significant impact on their social space or in the domain in which they were working. The second is that we were not going to look at movements. The movements are very important in our sort of social history, if you will. But we decided that we would exclude movements because that would then just broaden the canvas even more. And we just focus on direct CSO or direct intervention in the social space. We also decided that we may not look at, and it wasn't a definitive negative, but we said we may not look at some organizations that have been written up about extensively. That we wanted to also bring to the notice of our readers smaller organizations that were not that well known, but which had had a very significant impact. We also we said that our selection must be geographically broad-based. It mustn't be drawn from one region or only. We must endeavor to bring to the reader interventions across the length and breadth of the country. And finally, our choice was also determined by a decision that it must be multidimensional, it must look at a cross-section of interventions. So we decided that we wanted to work on or look at organizations that had, for instance, worked on women's empowerment or poverty alleviation or water and sanitation. The focus wasn't going to be on any one subject. It was going to be a mix of subjects. So that is that's the basis on which we made the selection.
Right. Thank you, Vikram. So Neelima, coming to you, can you tell our viewers some of the, I'll ask you to narrow it down further from 24 to maybe 2-3, if you want to discuss those initiatives very quickly for the understanding of our viewers, that to give them a flavor of the book. one or two initiatives which you would like to talk about while editing the book. You have also written one or two of the chapters, a couple of chapters also in the book, but most of the chapters in the book were written by, very importantly, they were written by the people who founded and worked in these initiatives. That was wonderful. So it's almost like from the horse's mouth, straight from the horse's mouth. So Neelima, if you can talk about a few.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Sayantan, and really a pleasure to be here and talking about this book with which we've been living for the last 1 year, to now finally put it in everyone's hands, and it is a real pleasure. So that's a tough question that you've asked me to pick, a few out of all, and it's going to be impossible for me to do that. But like you said, to try and give the audience a flavor of what is contained in these 24 stories. So one thing, of course, Sayantan, that you also said that we wanted the protagonists to speak themselves. And that was also a conscious decision that we took in the beginning, because we had one choice was that we write it in a case study mode, that we go and see them. But we said, no, we want to hear from people themselves. So somebody can say there's a subjectivity in that storytelling, but there's also a wealth of richness and nuances that come in when the protagonist speaks himself or herself. So just to kind of, and also maybe one more thing that I want to say before. You will also notice in the book that maybe while the 24 stories represent most of the decades since independence, there is no story from the last decade. And that's because, Sayantan, we felt that most of the interventions were still young enough and we had not had enough time to see what was the impact and whether it was enduring or not. So I'm just saying that there was no bias against the young organizations, but there are many actually. It was hard to choose. But talking about, what Vikram also said, that we wanted to deliberately make it a book which had all kinds of stories. So let's begin with South India. There are two extremely remarkable stories from South India, both kind of birthed and curated and expanded within the government system. One is Tamil Nadu's midday meal program, and the other is the Kudumbushri movement, which began in Kerala. Both these initiatives, and I'm saying it's not just about civil society intervention, so both these were actually kind of, nurtured by government, and both have had nationwide impact. The midday meal program became the prototype around which now there is a national level midday meal initiative. And it's really, the story is fascinating how the original idea, it started in the early 1950s, and from there on, people kept building on that idea, and it was only in the 70s that it got formal shape. But across party lines, across changes in people, somehow that idea stayed. It had its ups and downs, but it stayed. So it's a fascinating story, and most of us, I'm sure, do not know about the background of the midday meal, which we now take for granted happening in all the schools. Similarly, Kudumbushri, for a government to lead such a large program around women, and in many cases, the program becomes kind of questioning of the government system itself. But to still continue to nurture that program and give it space, it is really, really amazing and exceptional. And of course, that has then had links to many other programs that happened subsequently in the country. Actually, from South India, also there is another author that we have who's spoken about disabilities, beginning with the spastics movement and how that's. And so, as you can see, we are talking about the spastics and the disability sector. We are talking about the meal program. We are talking about women's empowerment and all within South India. The diversity that
social sector initiatives which actually the government took up and it scaled up, right? For instance, the Jamkhed model, which
absolutely,
which led to the accredited social health workers or ASHAs.
Absolutely.
Mirada, which became the SAG movement, and then Gram Vikas, of course, which was now we have the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. So this is like quite a collection. So coming to you, Jaya, when you do a book of this scale, when you look at all these years of development practice, from starting from the government to civil society organizations to, and you have corporate initiatives also, like the ITC's eChopal, and so I mean, like, how has the development sector evolved over the years? And so in the initial years, as Vikram's introduction very beautifully put it, the government wanted it to be the civil society organizations to be a part of it. Then as late as in the early 2000s, we had the corporate social responsibility coming in. So
Yeah.
can you give our viewers a brief, like how we have evolved over this years?
Yeah. So I'll start by picking on what you said a little bit earlier, was in terms of, again, reference to the selection of the chapters. Also, many of these we see as game changers. Like you said, they've kind of emerged at a certain point of time in our history, but the work they've done has gone on to influence government policy. Like the examples you mentioned, the ASHA program or the SHG inclusion, which now Mairada had incubated, Swachh Bharat, and several others, which like today we talk about the national education policy and the work that Eklavya had done back then. So several of these, you find spastics finds mentioned, the disability movement emerged from the work done 50 years ago. So there is, of course, a lingering process which is there in place. But what you asked me to talk about essentially is that the political economy at any point in time does determine the shape and nature of intervention that is kind of given birth to, right? So in terms of that, the kind of interventions that we see across the country, say in the 60s, was in response to a certain ecosystem that prevailed, right? You had instances, for instance, there was prevalence of drought, poverty was widespread. The government was kind of saying that we should be there in development, we should be there in doing welfare, but probably not equipped or not knowing which ways to go. So you then have a Seva Mandir or a Mairada and many others, which were there in different parts of the country. In fact, many Gandhian organizations through the 50s and 60s have done a lot of work, in the early years also. And they started addressing these intractable problems with very tangible processes. And these processes emerged in dialogue with the community. I think that criticality is something that you have to understand the socio-political context. You have to engage with the community. You have to understand your geography, setting, all of that. And you have to tailor your response to what is necessary. Of course, you don't bring all the skill sets. So you engage with whatever best you can bring, and then maybe there's some expertise which you can leverage from outside. So it's a lot of contextualized responses. So Seva Mandir's work on commons, for instance, because that was the context it was working in, the tribal communities coalescing around the commons. And there was a sense of, Neelima can speak better about it because that's her personal story also. But how the community could come together to leverage it both for social and economic benefit for themselves, right? And likewise, in the next decades, you had organizations like Pradhan, which were bringing in development professionals, but which were also creating localized solutions. So listening intently to the local communities, looking at what your context is out there. These seem to be fundamentals which are embedded in the work of all these organizations, that it was certainly not a top-down approach in any of them, but rather something that could build from the ground, right? So that's something that kind of grows through the years. 1991 as we all know, is this watershed where, you can actually see the nature of interventions before that and after that. I mean, while the economy grew in a certain way, there was also responses in the social sector, which kind of attuned itself to these changes that were emerging. So leveraging the markets, making use of the markets. So the poultry initiative, for instance, which had been incubated in Pradhan, but then which took on this whole social enterprise effort, is something that worked through the 90s, right? And then in 2000s, you see that growing all the more, say, with the cooperative initiative. I mean, one had seen examples of it in Amul and other such earlier, but here with coffee growers amongst indigenous communities in
the Araku one, right?
So there you see people coming together and making very interesting use of market linkages with Paris and with European countries. I mean, all these it shows that you can look at local problems, but dream and create solutions which are really like both relevant to the local, but also make use of the possibilities far beyond that geography. So
Right.
a lot of interesting threads one can draw from these stories.
Thanks, Jaya. So coming back to you, Vikram, so the sector, and I'd rather leave this question open to all of you. The sector has also been going through a kind of a churning, the whole entire development sector. So because of the FCRA rules that have been tightened, a lot of new and small nonprofits are also struggling on the ground. And now what I wanted to understand from you is that, that approach to funding and which sector to fund, is that changing? Or like for instance, is an area like climate change receiving enough funding now? Or like you think that rights-based work, the funding is dipping considerably compared to the early 2000s when we had the right to food movement, the right to education, the right to work, the right to information. There was a lot of rights-based movements, which Vikram, you explained also, you left out deliberately because you are not dealing with social movement. That's a material for another book of yours, probably. So how is the sector dealing with this churning, tightening of rules, and like which areas are getting funding? To start with you, Vikram.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely get a richer answer from Neelima and Jaya because they are deeply involved and they can give you their own perspective on how the sector is responding. Let me maybe just give you a sense of how these rules are impacting the relationship between the corporate world and the sector, because the CSR, 2% profits have to be, of course, allocated to socially responsible activities. And I find that corporates, there are three things that one could probably say about corporates. One is that the general sense that corporates are reluctant contributors to social progress is not right. I feel that most corporates have accepted that they must broaden their purpose to look beyond just the narrow focus on profitability or the narrow interest of their shareholders, and they must play a major role in sort of social, in let's say protecting or promoting or helping the interest of the stakeholder or the society in general. Their reputation is linked very much to that larger purpose. So second is that most corporates that I've dealt with, and I'm on several boards, are spending a disproportionate amount of time and money on issues related to skill development, poverty alleviation, health and water, and education. And there is, I think, a question that could be asked here as to whether or not there's whether or not money is being efficiently deployed. So I have my views on that, but I won't answer it. But it's leading to possibly excessive expenditure on a few sectors and a few regions of India, and to the exclusion of other sectors and other parts of India. So there is that issue that I think has to be addressed. And as far as the third issue, the question is that money coming from abroad, has got very tight, and government has, I think, made it more difficult for genuine philanthropy to contribute to social progress. And I think there is reason and good reason for government and social sector to work together to see how these particular issues can be resolved. Because we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is perhaps what might happen if the government continues to tighten its rules. But Neelima, Jaya, answer it from the perspective of
how are smaller nonprofits adjusting, or what is happening on the ground? If you can give us a little bit of a flavor, as to how are they coping with these changes?
Shall I go, Jaya?
You first, yeah.
So I think it's a very, very important question, Sayantan, that you've asked, and I think there needs to be more discussion on it. What you said rightly, I think the sector is seeing very deep shifts and changes. In great part triggered by the change in context. Like Jaya said earlier, the socio-political context always influences what kinds of responses do you see from civil society. So there's a larger socio-political context, but there is also the funding environment and maybe a link to that, because of which, like you said, the amount of money has changed, the quality of money has changed. And the quality of money is far more important than the quantity of money. The quality of money that is today coming to the sector, most of it is coming from corporates. The money that used to come from, let's say, foundations, which are of a slightly different kind, that money has shrunk vastly. Government funding to civil society organizations has also shrunk. So really, we are talking of bulk of the money is corporate money. There is also another kind of money that has grown a lot, which we are not talking about here, which is individual philanthropy. Along with the rise of the billionaire population in India, there is also rise in individual high net worth philanthropy. But there is also rise in retail philanthropy, people like you and me giving 2,000 rupees, 4,000 rupees, 1,000, all that. So if you talk about institutions, civil society organizations, and what does this new kind of money mean to them? Like you rightly said, small organizations are suffering. Because catering to corporate money or working with corporate money, corporates require much higher levels of compliances and reporting that very small organizations are able to cope. So they're not able to cope with that. So normally they are not able to access much of that money. Large organizations which are able to access this money from corporates, even for them, while, as Vikram said, corporates have risen to this 2013 amendment and put out the money. But I think one kind of money that corporates do not put into is building institutions, or let's say building the ecosystem, or in rights-based anything that can't be measured is hard for a corporate, given its DNA, given its ways of looking at things. For a corporate to put money into that is harder. So I'll maybe stop just having said that I think the nature of the money that's coming in is impacting long-term institution building work in this sector. The results that you're seeing today is because somebody else invested in these institutions in the past. And today I feel nobody is investing in institutions for the future. So that's something that all of us as a society need to think about. But I'll pass it on to Jaya.
So Jaya, I'll just intervene just quickly. So if you can tell our viewers about which of the sectors where this money is actually going into, and which of the sectors where the money should go and it's not going into. I mean, like, what is the sense you're making? I mean, like,
like Vikram touched upon it. I think areas like education, water, sanitation, health to an extent.
Whatever is measurable.
Livelihood, skill development. These have kind of, in the current currency, that's what is getting most attention. What needs to be done, I'll go back to what I said earlier. Listen to the communities. Listen to the people and what they need. That needs to be studied further, understood further. I mean, and the responses have to be contextualized. It would be wrong for me to sit here and say, put your money in this, right? In fact, the best money would be the kind of money which is untied, which is what a lot of foreign funders at one point, I mean, I'm basketing them in foreign funders, but a certain kind of funding at a certain point in time, which many NGOs, which we call credible today, have been able to come here because they got money with no strings attached, right? They were able to, so even within their context, say in a Ganjam district or in a Kotra district, they were able to tailor responses even there in a different way from village to village also. If A village wanted something, the village could want something else. So these cannot be like ideas which are generated sitting in rooms like this. This has to be done in dialogue with with people, and that is a long process. And the other part is to be patient. It's like patient capital, really. You are sowing the seeds. One has to be patient about the results coming out maybe 2 decades later. It's not something that comes in neat 3-year, 5-year cycles, which is what the current currency of investment is looking to, that they want to see results to be very immediate, whereas these results may take, so for instance, if it's even recovering the environment or the nurturing, I mean, a tree takes 5 years, 7 years to grow, for it to fruit. So one has to have that kind of patience for these seeds to kind of take root, for communities to accept, adopt them, and then I guess that's the kind of story that many of these interventions have also tried to bring about. That you also will have failures along the way. There's no room for failure now. In the current funding climate, that there's no room for reflection or introspection and saying that we tried something, it actually didn't work out. It becomes sort of almost like a black mark on your name that we shouldn't work with that NGO anymore, right? So allow room for experimentation, to allow room for fear, to allow room for learning. I think those would be the kind of funding also which would be making a lot of meaning in today's times.
Thanks, Jaya. Vikram, one last question, because we are running short of time. Wanted to understand from you, how has private philanthropy evolved over the past decade or so? We have Neelima also mentioned, you also did in ways that we have more billionaires now. So are the rich willing to contribute for social causes? How is it changing? I'm talking about outside CSR, from individual funding, and I'm not talking about small individual contributions. Yeah, the retail ones, or crowdfunding, for instance. Where are firstly, are the rich willing to contribute, and where are they wanting to put their money?
I think the answer to this question, of course, is quite complex, because it'd be difficult to generalize. But since you've asked it, and I will generalize, and I'd generalize in the direction of saying that a majority of the rich or the large corporates are beginning to so recognize that there is no trade-off between principles and profits. If clearly these people cannot afford to be principled if they don't make profits. But at the same time, I think they're beginning to recognize that if they don't abide by principles, their stakeholders will argue that they do not deserve profits. And this balance that they're looking to strike between corporate profits and corporate principles is the big issue that corporate management, and I think the very rich are, you might say, struggling with. It's not that straightforward. How do you strike the right balance? But the underlying point that is important to make here is that they do recognize the importance of broadening their vision to look at not just the interest of the shareholder, as I said earlier, but at the larger picture of society. They cannot succeed if society fails. So my own view is that it's moving in the right direction. Now, where is it going? I already answered that. This is where I have a slight concern, that money is concentrated in those areas that are measurable. This is what Neelima and Jaya have also said. It's concentrated in sectors with which they're familiar, and it also concentrated in areas that deliver results quickly. So the very important point, I think, that comes out in, let's say, Neelima's chapter on Seva Mandir and a number of other chapters, is the importance of developing communities that appreciate their own role in actually improving their livelihood. And that process of community development and community recognition is not an overnight process. It takes decades for communities to actually, be built. And if corporates were to look towards creating institutions and developing communities, then their impact would be longer lasting. That I don't think has happened yet. And that's the point I think Neelima was also making.
Right. Neelima, so what I understand is that there is a need for dialogue, right? I mean, like how can you better put it, in the sense that the actors need to sit together and talk it out, and for better flow of funds, and the rules and the regulatory framework, right? How would you summarize that in terms of the learnings, both you, Jaya and Neelima, in terms of after looking at doing this book and looking at all these initiatives and where we are now, it's quite a remarkable set of initiatives we have put together, right? So how do we carry that legacy forward, and not, the newer organizations, like you were talking, you didn't get them because they're still in that process of showing results. So
yeah, no, thank you, Sayantan. You've actually got on to the core kind of objective or purpose that we had behind this book, that if this can be spur to more conversations. And so by no means, can we say that we have any, looking back at the last 75 years through the lens of these 24 organizations, we haven't come up with anything, that we can say this is the silver bullet that we've discovered. Not at all. In fact, the only thing that we've learned is that each of these 24 are so context specific, and yet they're all bound by unifying principles, which you see across all of them, whether that was done by a corporate sector person or by government or by a non-profit. And if that can lead to a greater kind of mutual respect of each other and a conversation where we begin to understand, and that's why, I don't have a long answer to what you said, except to reinforce exactly what you said, that we the book would have served its purpose if there are more conversations that happen around it across sectors and across actors, not just speaking within our own boxes, but speaking with others who are maybe not like us, who are thinking differently. Also, the other hope, and I'll stop there, Sayantan, for us was that if the younger generation will read these stories, because we realize that many of the stories, which, let's say for my generation, were kind of stories that we knew about and we were, grew up listening to them or were born with them. Many of the younger generation I see don't know about them. And so our real hope is that the younger generation will also look at these stories and continue this conversation in the future. So I'll stop here on that wishful thinking note.
Yeah, your last word.
Yeah. So I think that's this importance of dialogue. I think that's huge, really. And I would dare to say that even within the nonprofit world that I've been part of, we've not been very good at it. So it's like every NGO is working in its context and thinking that we've done our best here. So I think even for nonprofit organizations to step out and say that we can learn from each other, we need to collaborate. We need to collaborate with different organizations. So now, because given the primacy of the market, for instance, we should be engaging, the NGOs should be engaging more with markets in a more proactive manner. Work with the government is often for NGOs like, okay, we need to please them, otherwise we'll get into their bad books. But again, that channel has to be more constructive. I mean, the government, often there are some very nice officials, which Myra talks about, Basics talks about. This one great official, Development Service Center, who's kind of facilitated things, Ekalavya. And then when that person goes, the whole thing changes. So how can relationships between government and organizations working on the ground be more empathetic and working together kind of to solve things? I would really want to see a healthier working relationship there. For CSR and NGO, again, it's like corporates come to NGOs or whatever, extend to NGOs just for this CSR mandate, that we have whatever, 1 crore of rupees to be spent in 5 villages, please make a plan for us kind of stuff. I would see this dialogue again in my imaginary future to perhaps extending a bit more, really. I mean, if corporates were to really embrace this idea of profits, people and planet, the shared value kind of a thing that we talk about, then this dialogue with communities, with NGOs who probably have a better way of dialoguing with communities, with government, it can happen in a more organic manner than just contracting an NGO and saying that please help us do this CSR activity, right? So the corporates, NGOs, governments all need to be sitting together and talking together and working out solutions together, of course, with the community as the primary edifice on which this entire dialogue is built. So, I mean, in a world that I see in the future, I would see this happening with greater empathy, with lesser suspicion, with more of a purpose in terms of making actual lasting changes, sustainable changes, which go beyond just this, success in 1 or 2 years, but which are really kind of take us through over several decades and bring us to that better future, really. So,
okay, so thanks Jaya, thanks Neelima, thanks Vikram for this lovely conversation. It was a really good to talk to you guys and understand the nuances, and congratulations again for this lovely book, Anchoring Change, 75 years of grassroots interventions that made a difference.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.